You're listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Well, welcome to Boomers Today. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. Of course, each week we bring you important and very useful information on issues facing baby boomers, their parents, and other loved ones. And as I always do on each show is to thank everybody for all their support. Our listeners are growing each and every day, and we grow it organically. We don't do any promotion at all, so I want to thank all of you for sharing any individual shows or our entire podcast with friends and family. So many of you listen to it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. Some of you go directly to our website at boomerstodayradio.com. And just want to thank you. And as I say, I know why you're sharing these podcasts with friends and family to listen to, because we have great guests, and not going to disappoint you today because we have with us Claire Day, who has been on staff of the Alzheimer's Association since 2001. She is the Chief Program Officer at the Northern California and Northern Nevada chapter, and as such oversees all care and support operations and research initiatives. Ms. Day is a clinical social worker and received her degree from Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania. She has more than 20 years of experience as a family and professional educator in dementia care and has authored 2 forwards to Alzheimer's caregiver books. In 2018, Ms. Day was appointed chapter lead for the U.S. study to protect brain health through lifestyle interventions to reduce risk, the U.S. Pointer, in California in partnership with UC Davis. U.S. Pointer is a 2-year clinical trial to evaluate whether lifestyle interventions that simultaneously target multiple risk factors protect cognitive function in older adults at increased risk for cognitive decline. So may I call you Claire?
Please do.
All right, Claire. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Day. And I look forward to all of our guests, but I especially was looking forward to speaking with you today because it's just such an important subject matter. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for having us with you today.
Yeah. So we're going to get into some basic things, basic maybe to you and I who, been in the business a while, but certainly maybe not basic to some of our listeners. Then we'll get into a little more detail as far as, progress that hopefully, is being made in treatment with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. But maybe you could just give us a little overview on the difference when people hear Alzheimer's or people hear dementia. What's the main differences between those two and maybe, other forms of dementia as well?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And it's especially important to start if we are, when we do start to talk about new treatments, because there is a difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. And dementia is really what we consider to be that umbrella term. It's really a collection of symptoms that are related to cognitive decline. So they can include things like changes in cognition, so your changes in your memory. And we see oftentimes the beginning signs of some of these memory changes as those short-term memories, right? Those things that really help to impact activities of daily living and your independence. But they can be behavioral and psychological changes. And dementia they are due to biological changes in the brain, but the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia is that biology. So dementia, think of it like flowers, right? So you have lots of different types of flowers like tulips and carnations and roses. That would be the word flowers, and underneath all those different types, that's like Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia or lewy-body dementia or dementia related to Parkinson's disease. They would be like the different types of flowers. All different types of biology changes in the brain that are causing those similar symptoms, which include cognition changes, memory, the things that we know of as those classic warning signs. But there is a distinction. So dementia is really broad. It's general. It sort of describes the symptoms, what's important is what's happening in the brain, and that's certainly, we're learning more and more about the importance of really understanding and distinguishing that because of what these new treatments could look like.
Gotcha. So would you, somebody that goes in for a evaluation, all right, and they go to a specialist in the area, and the diagnosis comes out as dementia, would you say that it's pretty certain that they have some form of dementia, but maybe the doctor or whatever the tests are, they just weren't able to pinpoint the type of dementia? It's kind of like saying you got a virus, but we don't know exactly what. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and that's oftentimes the case. And I think one of the other things that we have in our corner today that we didn't have a decade ago is better diagnostic tools. And we're starting to see the emergence of biomarkers, of those biological markers, which you may be familiar with. Like a biological marker is a part of you that can show whether there's evidence of disease. And most commonly people think about it as, if you've ever had a blood test to see what your cholesterol level is, that's a biomarker. And 10 years ago, we weren't anywhere close to having the type of testing that we could actually use to distinguish the biology of disease in a living person. And so part of it is hard to tell. A lot of these symptoms of different types of dementia present similarly, right? Short-term memory loss, trouble planning and executing their daily living. There are distinct differences, but very hard to sometimes tell on just a basic cognitive exam. And so we're excited about sort of this advancement in biological markers, and most excitingly is the potential for things like a PET scan to be used to aid in diagnostics when it comes to someone who's presenting, because it is going to be important to understand the difference. And even the medications that have been available up until this point really are only for people with Alzheimer's. So if you have, vascular dementia or frontotemporal dementia, those medications that are currently being prescribed for Alzheimer's aren't really going to be of benefit for you. So it is important that we try to understand the differences, and it's important, I think, for families to advocate to what I call double clicking. When you double click on something on your computer, you want to learn a little bit more. We got to double click when we just get a generalized dementia diagnosis, because there's so much more to it now when it comes to this era of treatment.
To try to get the absolute proper diagnosis, all due respect to our general practitioners out there, but they may not be trained in this area. So would you have any particular recommendations to a family who's confronted with this? What type of specialist would you recommend going to, and what type of tests do you recommend having?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I think we are also starting to see general practitioners looking to get more information about this, because they're seeing the tsunami of our aging nation, and they do recognize they're going to be the first line of defense, and they self-admittedly will say they don't feel that they're prepared to diagnose Alzheimer's in their offices. So, sometimes it's good to start with your family practitioner, because they do know you the best. A specialist who's never met you before doesn't have that sort of baseline of your cognition and memory and how you've presented in office visits before. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to start with your general practitioner. But if your GP feels that there is cause for concern, they will most likely recommend you seeing either a neurologist or a geriatrician who might have a little bit more expertise. And if they don't, part of the issue is sometimes they're like, oh, well, everybody's getting older. Everybody forgets as they get older. And while that's very true, we've all walked into a room and forgotten why we've walked in there. There is a difference between normal aging and and Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And so if you're personally feeling like this is more than just normal aging, I'll give you an example. We had someone call our helpline once who found her tape dispenser from her office in her freezer. She lived alone, and she spent 2 weeks rationalizing how it got in there. And it finally dawned on her, my son hasn't been over, no one's been in my house. The only way that could have gotten in my freezer is if I put it there. But she had no recollection of that short-term memory of having it and putting it in the wrong spot. Mm-hmm. That's cause for concern, right? That would be someone who says, this is not just normal aging. This is a change in my cognition that's impacting my ability to be independent in some way. And so in those cases, I think where if you happen to live in an area where you have access to an institution that might have a full memory center, wonderful opportunity to start there. But I think generally neurology and geriatrician are also really good places to start. I think there's general concerns about the ability, the wait time to get into some of those practices. And if you've got an emerging cognitive need, you don't want to wait 8 to 9 months to get seen. And so that's why I say sometimes, seeing your general practitioner isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it's okay to advocate to say, you know what, no, I need more testing. I don't feel that this is just normal aging. To me, it seems a little bit more than that. And part of what we're really starting to see is people are self-advocating for these types of tests and recognizing that it's okay to talk about cognitive loss, because while it's not a normal part of aging, there shouldn't be the stigma that's associated with Alzheimer's and dementia, and let's start talking about it. And that starts with our general practitioners.
Right. Well, what do you say to people who may say, well, I've been diagnosed or it's quite certain I have some form of dementia. I'm not going in for any type of treatments because it's not curable. So I'm just going to have to live life best I can. What do you say to those people who choose not to go in for any type of medical advice or treatment?
I would say that I would urge people to really understand the changing landscape of Alzheimer's care, because it is a new day. And I hope we're going to get the opportunity to talk about some of these new treatments that are coming down the pipeline. Right. They did not exist even 2 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And so they didn't exist in the early 2000s. They didn't exist in the early 2020s. And now we have this opportunity where there is evidence building that some of these treatments can improve cognition. These are the first time we've had disease-modifying medications. So, if we were talking in 2010, I would say, I understand everybody's got to make their own decisions. The medications that are available really only treat the symptoms. It's a personal choice, and that all still rings true today. And if you have Alzheimer's disease in particular, there is more and more reason for people to detect this early, as at the earliest point of intervention, and evaluate whether or not these treatments are right for you.
We're going to get into these treatments right after our quick break, I promise, just to recognize our sponsor. Okay, so I'll be back with you, Claire, in just about 30 seconds here. So do you know anybody who may be concerned about an older driver? Well, Senior Care Authority's Beyond Driving with Dignity program is a facilitated self-assessment program for older drivers. This program has been designed to serve as a vital tool to facilitate older drivers and their families as they make the appropriate decisions regarding the future of one's safe driving career. If the individual is a safe driver, an advisor will provide him or her with strategies on how to remain a safe driver as they progress through the aging process. If driving retirement is the appropriate decision, then the individual and their family are offered possible alternatives, resources, and a specific plan to ensure a smooth and successful transition from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. So to learn more, go to www.beyonddrivingwithdignity.com or call 877-907-8841 to connect with a senior care authority advisor in your area. We're back with Claire Day, who's been on the staff of the Alzheimer's Association since 2001, Chief Program Officer at the Northern California and Northern Nevada chapter. So we started to talk, before we get into the treatments, maybe Claire, you could just share with us, if people want to learn more about the work you're doing, about the work the Alzheimer's Association is doing, what do you suggest they do? Where can they go to learn as much as possible?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. I think the most important thing, there's two ways. Obviously, if you're comfortable on the website, alz.org will give you all of this really robust information, and most importantly, we'll connect you to the chapter that's locally in your community. We have chapters throughout the entire United States. But we also have a 24-hour helpline, which is 800-272-3900. And that's a great first step. If you've got questions, if you're looking for a support group, or if you're looking for an educational program, if you're seeing changes in yourself or a loved one, if you want more information about some of these new treatments and don't know where to turn, you've got a live person who answers that phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And just a great resource for people. You can learn about how to get involved with your local chapter, whether it's through the Walk to End Alzheimer's or volunteering or attending one of our programs. Just a really, really robust way to kind of get started.
Great. And that 800 number, they should call that regardless where they're located throughout the country, correct?
Absolutely. It will work anywhere in the United States, and they'll be able to provide you with your local chapter information as well.
Great. I'm going to give you the opportunity to, why don't you state that 800 number again?
800-272-3900.
Great. So Claire, let's talk about progress in treatment, risk factors. There's been, so much talked about regarding Leqembi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yes.
So I'm going to just turn it over to you. You're the expert in this area, so maybe you could just talk to us about it, and people maybe get a better understanding of, maybe they have a loved one that, when they want to know if they could qualify or not qualify, and I'll let you talk about this. So much going on.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and it's a rapidly changing landscape. A lot has happened, in 2023 and in 2021 with the first approval of a disease-modifying medication. And like I mentioned earlier, prior to that, we've had some FDA-approved therapies that really do just treat the symptoms. You might be familiar with some of them. There's sort of two classes of those medications. One are called the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which is your Aricept and Exelon and Razodine. And then in 2003, they introduced a drug that was for sort of moderate to late stage called Namenda. That's a glutamate modulator working on a different part of the brain. But these drugs are traditionally for people with Alzheimer's in the early to sort of early moderate stage, and again, just are treating symptoms. And in 2021, we saw evidence of the first ever disease modifying, so changing that underlying biology of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a buildup of amyloid plaque, that beta amyloid in the brain, which causes cells in your brain to stop working the way they're supposed to. It's also marked by a second type of a protein marker called tau. And tau protein is sort of a transport system in your brain. And what they find in the brain of someone with Alzheimer's is this buildup of beta amyloid, these deposits of beta amyloid, and these tau tangles around your brain that essentially stop the function, right? So they stop the messages from being delivered the way they're supposed to, and cells die off. And when cells die off, our brain stops functioning the way it's supposed to. So in 2021, with the first disease-modifying drug, what we saw is that these drugs can actually address that buildup of beta amyloid. And Aduhelm, or aducanumab, which was approved by the FDA in 2021, didn't maybe get off to the brightest start. But in early 2023, we saw the results of the FDA accelerated approval of this new drug that you referenced called Leqembi. And Leqembi works by targeting that amyloid beta, that primary component of those plaques. And essentially what they saw in this clinical trial was that removing amyloid from the brain provided measurable, meaningful benefit in people with early Alzheimer's. And so in their phase 3 trial, Leqembi delayed cognitive decline by about 5.3 months compared to the placebo after 18 months of treatment. And I think some of the question around, well, 5.3 months doesn't sound like a lot of time, but to someone in the early stages of the disease, that time is immeasurable in a sense, because it allows for the continuation of remaining independent, of making their own care plans, of making their own decisions, and having that ability to remain independent. So this new target, which then in July of 2023 was approved with what we call traditional approval. And the only difference between accelerated and traditional approval, obviously, is the length of time. But accelerated approval really just applies to drugs that have life-saving potential. So essentially it's a way for the FDA to prioritize reviewing the science behind drugs that could actually save lives. And Alzheimer's disease obviously falls into that category. But it then also went through that longer traditional approval and was fully approved by the FDA in July of 2023. And what's also exciting is at the same time, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, have now improved their coverage and will make Leqembi available to people who are on Medicare. We are still, when I said to you this is an ever-changing landscape, this all sort of happened in a 9-month period. Everything happened really, really fast, or 6-month period, really. And we're still starting to understand what that means. What does coverage mean? These are expensive drugs. They're different than just this is an infusion. This is where you would have to have that qualifying PET scan prior to the receiving the medication, because we need to make sure that you do have that evidence of those amyloid and tau tangles on your brain in order to qualify for these medications. So it's really modernizing, in a sense, the way we think about diagnosis and the way we think about treatment. And at the same time, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are also updating their requirements and updating their coverage to ensure that people that want this drug, that qualify for this drug, and have access to this drug can get the drug, which is really, really important. If we have a treatment that really isn't attainable or accessible to anyone unless you're in a clinical trial, it's really not news, right? It's not helpful.
Right.
But
right.
having the ability for people to really be able to access this is what has been, I think, the biggest change as we've started to see CMS really respond to what people are asking for.
Yeah. So as it relates to Leqembi, you had mentioned that there's been approval by, for Medicare, to cover the costs or a good portion of the costs. I don't know the particulars, but my question is this, that unfortunately we're seeing, at least I'm seeing, I don't know what the statistics are, younger and younger people coming down with the disease, all right, or at least being diagnosed with it. And if they're at an age that they're not on Medicare yet, has there been any progress as far as insurance, private insurance covering this, or that hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is some progress, and there have been some insurance companies that have out of the gate said that they will cover. I know Aetna was one for sure. We actually, I just had this conversation with someone yesterday, and I'm now trying to remember what the other two were that she mentioned. So we're seeing private insurance respond. We have seen some companies that have said that they're not going to cover it, and I think that's where we as an organization, we certainly, for us, access is really important. Equitable access is really important. This can't be a medication that's only available to people that live in big cities who have great health insurance, or have, access to a diagnostic center. This has to be available to anybody that wants it. And so we're certainly working on ensuring that people that want this drug and are qualified for this drug get the drug, and that's part of what our advocacy work is around, is ensuring that health equity, and that we're thinking about this beyond just what the recommendations come out. Because I think your point is a good one. It may not be that necessarily more and more younger people are developing Alzheimer's disease. It's that we're getting better at identifying that people under the age of 65 could have Alzheimer's disease. And while age is still our biggest risk factor, which is why the CMS decision was so important, because 1 in 8 people over the age of 65, 1 in 3 people over the age of 85 have Alzheimer's. We do know that there are younger people, and that we've seen people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's very less common, not as common, but they should have the same access. So we're starting to see some real progress there.
Great. So I've read, various things, and you gotta take everything with a grain of salt, but with Leqembi, you hear that it's, needs to be someone at maybe early stage of Alzheimer's, but can you give any particulars? Because I've also heard that somebody who is, really overweight may not qualify, things like that. I mean, any insight you could give to us relative to that?
Yeah. So I think the thing that's really coming out with these potential, or these new treatments, they're called monoclonal antibodies. So Aduhelm was the first one, Leqembi is now the second one, and then there was a third one that at a scientific conference in July of 2023, the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, donanemab released its top-line results. They're under FDA approval, so they're not approved yet by the FDA, but starting to go through that process. Same thing, a monoclonal antibody. All of the evidence that I've read is really indicating to us that the earliest point of intervention seems to reap the best benefits. So at the earliest stage of the disease, even with Leqembi, the slowing could have been as much as 60% compared to a placebo. And so I think it just goes to the argument of why early detection is important, and why we need to really talk about memory loss and aging in a way that doesn't stigmatize, because it's you've been doing this for as long as I have, if not longer, And there's still such a stigma around aging issues and especially around dementia. And so these drugs will work at the best when you're identifying the earliest possible signs. And I think that we are also seeing this movement towards understanding what some of these high risk for disease categories are, like the cardiovascular risk factors, and whether or not what I think how all of this plays together, right? Your risk for cardiovascular, like heart disease and diabetes and hypertension, are all huge risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And so when we think of the future, I see a world where we see these treatments that address the underlying biology of the disease and actually can address the symptoms of the disease, combined with this sort of recommendation of what a brain healthy lifestyle could look like. We've seen so much progress in risk reduction strategies. It's not the answer. It's not the only answer. But I think it's going to be a big part of the solution, that it will not be one or the other. It will be both together, is that we'll have these potential treatments and we'll be teaching brain health like we teach good cardiovascular health. And that's certainly what we're trying to build evidence with the U.S. Pointer study that you referenced in the beginning of the session, is really looking at cardiovascular health, exercise, diet, medical management of things like blood pressure and blood sugar and cholesterol, because they all do seem to be connected in some way.
Claire Day, thank you so much for joining us. Please go to alz.org, check it out. So much to learn, and we got to have you back. So much happening in this field. So Claire, thank you for joining us on Boomers Today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. Please be safe. We'll talk to everybody next week.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.